Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure to have my friend here, DJ. We've known each other for 3 years, more than 3 years, now close to 4 years. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Big data is now becoming more like a norm, which used to be very what we call a luxury item for people to basically say collecting data is expensive and mining the data is another technique. Why is it happening now?
I think there's a number of things that are coming about. And in fact, you heard in the previous panel a couple of the key parts of that, in fact. As Jay Krebs, who is actually engineer number one of the analytics team at LinkedIn, point out that we've got all these new technologies first. So we've got a whole tier of new technology solutions that don't cost to $1 million, $2 million just to start by putting in there. You can go out, you can get these things deployed, you can get them put out on AWS, you can get stuff really moving very quickly. I think it's frankly finally an appreciation from the business side of what data people can bring to the world. And it happens across a few different dimensions, I think, that where this recognition is happening. The first is, it's funny, like, how many people actually ever watch Star Trek? Wow, the rest of you are liars, because I can see how much gray hair there is. But you go to certain audiences and you make these references, they're like, Star Trek? What, you mean the movie only that just came out? But in Star Trek, you've always got your science officer. You've got Spock on the bridge. It's like, why wouldn't you, if you got your exec team, why wouldn't you have your science officer or your Spock in all these meetings? Like, why wouldn't you have a person that sits there and says, well, here's an assessment, or here's a way to quickly come up with a thing. Appropriate enough, what's the science officer's name? And the next generation is data, depending on where you live. But that realization and that recognition that people have kind of gotten religion of saying, oh wait, you know what? If we have that person, we may not always make the right decision, but we'll be able to at least be adequately informed about the decisions we make. But then we're also, if we do make the wrong decision, our ability to course correct will be much more quick than otherwise. The second part of that part that the businesses recognize is the ability to turn data into direct products, and whether that's a recommendation engine like you see on Netflix, or a jobs recommendation on LinkedIn, or people you may know that's used everywhere. All of those aspects drive the business now, and the ability to do that is finally, I think it's getting its due. And so there's a business drive along with technology oomph.
Do you think the technology is driving the companies to look at data more available? Or do you think the companies are shifting to drive the technology to make the data available?
In the case of many enterprise companies that are especially in the financial institutions, I think it's extraordinarily difficult for them it's hard for them to have the technology drive them, because they have heavy audit compliance. There's just realities of the amounts of data that they're trying to push through that create those barriers. In the smaller companies, I think that's oftentimes flipped, is the technology provides a mechanism to be a disruptor in the field, and not just a small disruptor, a massive disruptor. And it puts things, it basically gives a mechanism for the business to grow massively.
Do you think then the startups, especially now that you have transitioned, and by the way, congratulations that you've been named the top most famous influential data scientist.
Larry Page is that.
Larry Page has been you, but I think he deserved it.
I agree.
And I think you and Jeff and I think a lot of others followed you, and I think I'm surprised to see how many really cool people out there. But the term data scientist is something actually you and Jeff brought in realistically into organizations such as Facebook and LinkedIn. To be honest, I mean, when we first met about three and a half years ago, there wasn't the word data scientist yet. It was more like a data engineer or more like a data miner. but the science has evolved in data, and it's playing critical role, and it's most sought out position nowadays in the industry. And how did that change your life?
Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing is, actually maybe it's a question, how many people here actually call themselves or actually put data scientist on their title? All right. Thank you, Eric. Right. The rest of you, what are you doing? Come on. It's in the top 5 most in demand fields. You want to get a job offer, like, look, just put data scientist on. I think it's actually, there's a couple things I think that show that this is data overall has come about. The first is that they've got these lists of the so-called top people or most powerful people in the field, and one thing I think that I always have to say when this lists come out, while it feels good, but I think it's also needs to be pointed out that none of this could be done with like the Jay Krebs, the Monicas, the Pete Skomrocks, all these other people, the Anmols, all these guys are what created the ecosystem that got this going. And then getting other companies like Eric at Netflix, I mean, you obviously, Umar, Cloudera, everyone kind of coming together, laying a foundation. So like all of us have been doing data for a long time, but why hasn't there been a strong community? And I think what was missing, frankly, was there wasn't a home and there wasn't a set of terms that you'd look for. So if you just look at the terms of what you'd call yourself, is it statistician, is it analyst, is it business analyst, is it research scientist, is it engineer, is it applied engineer, is it data engineer, is it operations, is it data services, is it DBA? And so we're fragmented, and we didn't intend to create a new title. That was not the goal. The goal was to get HR off our backs. And because, LinkedIn had grown, I think we were like at 400, somewhere in that range. Facebook was 600, 700. And so the HR team came in and said, hey, look, you guys have your titles all over the place, like all these different crazy titles. You need to come up with a consistent leveling scheme, like junior, senior, principal, and then term. Is it analyst or whatever? And what we found is you tell somebody that you try to advertise with these roles, you'd be like, oh, you're an analyst. You'd be like, I'm not a Wall Street person. And they say, well, research scientist. Like, well, I don't do research. And you're like, okay, you're in data services. I'm not a DBA. Okay, well, so you kind of go down the default list and you're like, well, you need scientists to attract a certain type of a portion of the population to apply for your job, but you want to say data. So, data scientists. And that kind of got HR off our backs, and Jeff and I had just had lunch and sort of just kind of said, hey, how are we going to do this? And that was a term. And the rest is just kind of, it took off. And I think it's not because, I think it's one, because between LinkedIn and Facebook, we were doing a lot of hiring. But 2 was you had things like the Hadoop Summit that Yahoo was sponsoring. You had Hadoop World. You have all the cloud stuff going on. You had a lot of meetups that were going on. So people were just gravitating to this area, and it just becomes it's a natural ecosystem. So I think it's been, I mean, come on, people are all here gathered, learning about this stuff and trying to figure out, well, how do you make a go of it inside your individual type of organization, which could be from the 1-person startup all the way to the 50,000 person organization. And inside that, there's so many different roles that can be put under this. I think it's fantastic to see. Yeah,
and the transition that you've made now from being the data scientist at LinkedIn and driving all the cool analytics and products, now you're almost trying to help companies do similar things, and also trying to help them how to do it, or even advise them in that role. How's the transition working for you?
Well, so the first trick was to come up with a new term. This is sort of the genre. So we came up with this new role called data scientist in residence. And Reed was the one that suggested, he's like, well, if you came up with this term, shouldn't you just call yourself it in residence? And part of the recognition was there's a new type of functional role. And I think Jason from Mint was one of the first guys to have one of these functional roles, designer in residence. And it's kind of this hybrid. Are you an entrepreneur in residence? Are you an executive in residence? Are you a helper in residence? And it's kind of a combination. And so on any given day, what it might be looking and helping evaluate a number of companies for investment purposes. It may be helping a seed stage company really figure out what's next. It may be helping a large stage company in LinkedIn's portfolio figure out, just get some advice. If there's a fraud problem or a security problem, just going and jumping in and saying, hey, how can I be helpful? And I think that the thing that's made the transition very seamless or easy, especially with Greylock Partners, is everyone at Greylock has been a heavy operator at massive scale, whether it's Ashim, who's now being the CEO of Workday, John Lilly, who is CEO of Mozilla, James Slavic, who's running a big part of ads, David Z with Excite, or Reed, obviously, with LinkedIn and PayPal. So you have a lot of operators, and so figuring out how to be helpful in terms of not just kind of throwing out advice is that we can try to figure out how to direct very crisp advice for operators and explain to people why certain technologies or certain hiring choices or certain ways of looking at the business are critical, not just for now, but for the scaling portion of time.
So I know that we face the same challenge, even though we have data scientists and we do have PhDs, and typically most of the heavy lifting is to coordinate the science with engineering. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we've talked about when you're hiring happening, and then other things and the challenges that we faced most of the time, is finding the right engineering talent with a science background, or finding the right scientist with engineering background, or the combination of that, or the teams. What's your advice to the people who are trying to put up a team for analyzing the data today? What would you suggest? What type of people to look for?
Wow, you gave me such a freebie. So I wrote a book on this. It's freely available. You can download it from Amazon, or we're not charging for it at all, or from O'Reilly. It's called Building Data Science Teams, and it tries to argue exactly some of the ways to think about it. But I think there's this fundamental tension between what is production engineering and what is more of the, I wouldn't call it R&D, I'd call it prototyping. And I think one of the ways to think about it is prototype for 1x, build for 10x, engineer for 100x. And if you follow that paradigm, you get a lot of flexibility. And one of the things that's recognized is you have to have some flexibility in there of people to explore and try things, to come up with the next people you may know, to come up with things like Kafka, to come up with things like Voldemort, or the next career explorer. And so where does that innovation happen? Who cares, as long as it's coming up inside the organization? So if that's coming up by an engineering side or the data scientist side, I think so long as there's preservation and there's a broad set of skills of people that can bring that to bear, it's great. And so having people that can be really fast at prototyping, and people that can really make things happen at massive scale, they must go together. It's amazing when it works.
So right now there are companies built for two different purposes. One, do what you're good at, but while doing it, also build something that is good for the community or build for the technology and innovate. Whereas those are the companies that are actually there out to be successful, but their goal is to do something for their business, but they tend to use what is built by others. Mm-hmm. Which companies do you think will sustain in the long term? Where the companies that engineer and innovate and help the community to grow with it, or the companies that focus more on business and try to do their own innovation inside the business for applications, not the technology?
That's a great question, and I think it's one of these ones, since it's videotaped, I'm sure I'll regret the answer. It's like sort of like, no, who would need a desktop computer? That's ridiculous. This was one where I think the advice actually my father gave me on this was, don't be bleeding edge, but be cutting edge. And there's a question of how far out there you want to push. And so like a great example was LinkedIn was on the Cloudera distribution for quite some time. At some point we realized, hey, wait, we have to own this distribution because we're trying to do a lot of other things and we have to own the thing. And so it wasn't like, hey, we should just go out and own this right away. It became well, let's start here and then let's recognize the gaps. And then we said, wow, we got to own this. And even through that, even through, sort of going onto our own full distribution stack, we still keep a really close, tight relationship with the guys because it's an ecosystem. Yep. And so the same way, whether we're using any of your traditional database vendors, we're always sort of thinking like, well, how much of this can we incorporate from somebody else? How much can we use? How much of this do we have to build ourselves? And there's at some point, like if you have to own certain things, and there's certain things where you just say, like, this is just too expensive, or we're just not going to be good at this. Mechanical Turk, like you can own that stuff, but maybe at some point it's better to outsource it to one of the guys that work on top of it, like Crowdflower.
I'm sure there are companies out there right now, there are startups that are trying to basically do something like this. What is your advice? Is data now driving companies to do things differently? And if it is, what is your advice that they should consider doing?
I think advice happens in two parts here. And the advice I would give, generally speaking, to anybody working in data inside, and I think there's a startup and there's a big organization. We are beginning to see that shift inside the larger organizations where people are saying things like, hey, how do we have data more relevant? How do we build towards this? And you're seeing more acquisitions by all these companies. And so if you're inside an organization, how do you make the pitch or craft the argument that data needs to have that seat at the table and not the sort of kids table, the big table, and really have a key aspect of the strategy in making things work. And that is very doable these days. The second side is on the startup side. And I think the thing there, if you're doing a startup, the data space it almost feels like it's a little frothy right now. A lot of data startups, a lot of bubble almost down data. And so solve a real problem. And what do I mean by solve a real problem? Solve a problem for the developers. Solve a problem for the enterprise people. Solve a problem that's a real pain point that people have. And it's not hard to find these, by the way. These pain points are, I mean, like, it's like you try to spin up or get something very simple done and you're like, oh my God, there's not a good scheduler. Or just the management of these clusters. And so you make that ecosystem better, I think it's off to the races. And it doesn't have to be an either or. Backtype is a great example where they were acquired by Facebook, but they still open source their technology. A win for everybody.
And so there are a lot of open source technologies that are coming in, and so now technologies are becoming startups rather than startups building products that actually...
The pendulum is swung.
So where do you think this is headed? And in terms of Valley is now becoming more like it used to be a Silicon Valley, more like a chips-driven, computer-driven, but it is now becoming a data valley because everything is talked about is big data and all of this. But where are we headed? Is data now driving pretty much the future of industry? I don't want to go so far as to say data is driving the entire industry, because at the end of the day, so here's a classic challenge that I haven't been able to figure out yet. Can you do data as a data startup completely independent of an ecosystem? Like, could we have done everything around data that we did without LinkedIn and the rest of LinkedIn? And my answer currently is no. You need an ecosystem to support your data play. And so with that, I think one of the big things to consider is what are still the great products? Because if data is a tool or a mechanism without a product that is trying to support, I think we're putting the cart before the horse. Yep. And we need to keep that very closely in balance. At the same time, I think there's data has taken a backseat for so long that there's a phenomenal opportunity to keep on pushing the boundaries forward. And we're still seeing just
every day the big lift that data products are giving to every company.